June 1945. The island of Okinawa trembled under relentless bombardment. Explosions lit the night sky. But deep beneath the earth another battle was unfolding, one fought in silence in the suffocating darkness of caves. Entire families huddled together, mothers pressing hands over children's mouths to stifle their cries, fathers gripping rusted farm tools as if they were swords. The air reeked of damp stone and fear. For these civilians, the earth was both prison and shield. Above, American artillery rained down with terrifying precision. To the families hiding below, each blast felt like the footsteps of giants, monstrous invaders drawing closer. They had been told again and again that the Americans were demons, men who would slaughter children, dishonor women, and show no mercy. This wasn't rumor. It was doctrine woven into the very fabric of their schooling, their prayers, their loyalty to an emperor who demanded sacrifice. Yet survival is a stubborn instinct. In the caves, the will to live clashed violently with indoctrinated terror. Children whispered questions their parents could not answer. Was it safer to surrender to the unknown, or to die honorably in silence? The civilians were not soldiers, but they carried the weight of a battlefield psychology, obedience to authority, fear of shame, and the crushing pressure of collective duty. Every tremor of the earth deepened their dread. They could almost feel the Americans' boots pressing into the soil above. And in that moment, the caves became more than hiding places. They became a psychological battlefield where every heartbeat carried the rhythm of fear. What none of them could know was that the soldiers closing in were not the monsters they imagined. Soon the darkness would collide with light, and the story of Okinawa's hidden families would take a turn no propaganda had prepared them for. Long before Okinawa's caves became prisons of fear, the seeds of terror had already been sown. For years, Japanese civilians had been told a singular, unshakable truth: surrender was worse than death. This wasn't whispered rumor. It came from the highest authority. The emperor himself echoed through teachers, newspapers, and government-issued leaflets that rained down from the skies. Children recited in classrooms that Americans were beasts who would mutilate their captives. Women were taught that capture meant dishonor so unbearable, death was the only escape. Farmers, shopkeepers, and fishermen were instructed that the noblest act of loyalty was to sacrifice themselves for the emperor's divine mission. The message was clear: to live under the enemy was to betray both family and nation. Psychologically, this was the machinery of obedience in its most refined form. Fear wasn't simply a byproduct of war. It was engineered, reinforced daily by propaganda that exploited primal instincts: fear of death, fear of shame, and fear of isolation from the collective. Entire communities internalized the belief that surrender would stain not just themselves, but generations of their bloodline. Yet beneath that iron layer of indoctrination, a quieter voice survived, the voice of survival itself. A mother holding her child might wonder if death could truly be nobler than life. An elderly farmer, hearing the rumble of American tanks, might ask if loyalty to an emperor outweighed the will to see another sunrise. It was a conflict not just of politics, but of psychology, obedience versus instinct, the collective will versus the desperate urge of the individual to endure. By the time U.S. forces closed in, these conflicting truths collided inside every civilian heart. They had been told the Americans would show no mercy, but they had also heard rumors, whispered and quickly silenced, that some captives were spared. The uncertainty only deepened their terror. The deeper one went into Okinawa's caves, the more the world above seemed like another planet. The air grew damp and heavy, clinging to the skin. Darkness pressed in from every side, broken only by the faint flicker of oil lamps or the glow of smoldering wood. Families crouched close together, bodies trembling, breaths shallow. The caves became tombs in waiting, though the people inside still clung desperately to life. Mothers muffled the cries of their infants, terrified that even a single whimper might betray their hiding place. Fathers stood near the entrances with whatever they could hold: rusted farm tools, kitchen knives, even stones, tokens of resistance against an enemy they had been told was merciless. Children, eyes wide and glassy, absorbed every ounce of fear in the air, their young minds imprinting trauma that would haunt them forever. Inside these hollowed spaces, the psychology of survival twisted into something unnatural. The absence of sunlight disoriented time, Days and nights blended into one endless stretch of dread. Hunger gnawed at bellies, thirst cracked lips, and yet the fear of leaving was greater than the pain of staying. Every noise, a distant explosion, the scrape of rock, even the cough of a neighbor, triggered surges of panic. In psychological terms, they lived in hypervigilance, their bodies permanently locked in fight or flight. The caves offered shelter, but also stripped humanity bare. A child too young to understand silence might be pressed into stillness with a mother's trembling hand. A grandfather might quietly pray for a swift death rather than capture. Some families whispered about suicide, recalling government slogans that death was nobler than surrender. These weren't dramatic gestures of loyalty, but acts born from psychological suffocation, when fear itself leaves no room for rational thought. And yet, within that darkness, small flickers of resilience survived. A mother shared the last piece of dried rice with her child. A brother whispered a story to calm his sister's shaking. These quiet gestures were rebellions against despair, proof that even in a cave humanity fought to breathe. But outside, the footsteps of war drew closer. The Americans were advancing, combing the hills and ridges above with weapons ready. The civilians could not know whether mercy or slaughter awaited them. What they did know was that the thin rock above was all that separated their fragile world from the one they had been taught to fear most. Above the caves, the battlefield of Okinawa raged with relentless intensity. U.S. Marines pushed inland, every step contested by entrenched Japanese defenders. The ground was littered with shattered helmets, broken rifles, and the silence of the fallen. For the soldiers advancing, every cave mouth was a threat, each dark opening a possible nest of snipers or suicide fighters waiting to spring an ambush. They moved cautiously. Weapons raised, nerves stretched thin. The caves were both obstacles and mysteries. To a Marine, a shadowed entrance could conceal a single frightened child, or an enemy prepared to detonate grenades in a final act of defiance. The line between civilian and combatant blurred, feeding a constant current of suspicion. Inside the caves, the terror was mirrored. Civilians crouched low, straining their ears at the muffled thud of boots above. Some imagined the sound of knives being sharpened, others the laughter of enemy soldiers who would soon pour into their hiding place. Generations of warnings told them there would be no mercy, only slaughter. Fear painted the Americans not as men, but as monsters. This mirror fear defined both sides. Soldiers braced for treachery in every shadow. Civilians braced for brutality in every footstep. The tension was psychological as much as physical. Two groups locked in the same cycle of anticipation, each seeing the other as ruthless predators. And then, the first sounds broke the barrier. The scrape of rock, the echo of foreign voices, the unmistakable signal that discovery was near. Families clutched one another tighter, convinced their final moments had come. Marines steadied their rifles, ready to fire at the faintest sign of resistance. The collision was inevitable. Fear met fear, darkness met daylight, and a moment of decision loomed on both sides. Would the caves become graves, fulfilling the prophecy of propaganda? Or would something unexpected, something unthinkable emerge from the tension? The answer would arrive in the flicker of seconds, in the first human contact that neither side had truly prepared for. The moment came not with a gunshot, but with a whisper of movement. A young Marine, rifle tight against his chest, stepped toward the cave entrance. His heartbeat thundered louder than the artillery behind him. He expected a flash of steel, the sudden burst of a grenade, death erupting from the shadows. Instead, when his eyes adjusted, he saw figures huddled together. Not soldiers, not assassins, families. A woman clutched a child so tightly the boy could barely breathe. An old man trembled on his knees, hands raised, whispering prayers to gods who seemed deaf to his pleas. The Marines froze, stunned. This was not the enemy they had been trained to destroy. This was humanity, fragile, starving, and utterly broken by fear. For the Japanese civilians, the sight of the Marine was the end of everything. They had been told he would kill them without hesitation. Their minds braced for brutality. Mothers closed their eyes, waiting for the first strike. Children buried their faces in their parents' arms, trembling in silence. And then came the choice. The Marine lowered his rifle. Slowly, deliberately, he slung it over his shoulder. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a canteen of water and extended it forward. His hand shook not from fear, but from the weight of that moment. The families did not move. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Was this a trick, a cruel deception before the slaughter? For a long, breathless pause, no one dared to touch the offering. But thirst is stronger than terror. A boy no more than 7 reached out with shaking hands. The water touched his lips, and in that instant propaganda cracked. For the Marines it was a revelation. The war had taught them to dehumanize the enemy. Yet here was proof that the enemy was not faceless. It was mothers, fathers, children, no different from their own families back home. For the civilians, it was the collapse of a nightmare they had carried all their lives. The monsters were human. In the darkness of the caves, a single act of compassion rewrote the script of fear. But trust would not come easily. Even as the first families drank, others clung deeper to the shadows. Unwilling to believe that survival could come from the hands of the enemy, the battle of psychology was only beginning. The canteen of water should have been a clear sign: mercy instead of murder. Yet for many inside the caves, belief was harder to swallow than thirst. Some families crept forward cautiously, clutching children to their chests, eyes darting with suspicion. Others stayed hidden in the deeper chambers, whispering that it was all a trick, that the soldiers would strike once trust had been betrayed. This hesitation was not weakness. It was the product of years of conditioning. Civilians had been told surrender would mean torture, that Americans wore kindness like a mask before revealing their true cruelty. Psychologically, they were trapped in a state of paralysis. To hope was dangerous. To believe was to risk annihilation. Fear had become safer than faith. Mothers wept silently as they debated impossible choices. Was it better to starve quietly in the darkness or risk stepping into the light? Fathers argued in hushed voices, some urging surrender, others warning that dishonor would follow their families forever. In these moments, the caves became more than stone shelters. They were chambers of moral conflict, where survival fought against shame. The Marines, too, felt the tension. They held their weapons low but ready, aware that desperation could turn even civilians into combatants. They called into the caves in broken Japanese, offering food and medical aid. Some civilians recoiled, ears deafened by the dissonance between words of mercy and the indoctrination etched into their minds. A young girl finally took a step forward, barefoot and trembling. She reached for a cracker offered by one of the soldiers. Her family screamed for her to stop, convinced she was walking into death. But when she ate and survived, their certainty fractured. Hope long buried under fear stirred faintly, and so the caves became thresholds, doorways between death and life, despair and survival. Some crossed willingly. Others clung to the shadows. The war for Okinawa was fought with bombs and bullets above, but here in these caverns, it was fought with trust and terror, with the fragile psychology of people learning, for the first time, that the enemy might also be their salvation. For the Marines, every step into Okinawa's caves carried a weight heavier than their rifles. They had lost brothers in the battle above, friends cut down by sniper fire, comrades ripped apart by grenades. The instinct was to harden, to see the enemy as nothing more than targets. And yet in the darkness, they found not warriors but starving families. Some soldiers admitted later that it felt like carrying 2 wars at once, one against the Japanese military and another inside themselves. How could they reconcile compassion for civilians while rage for fallen comrades still burned so raw? A medic, his uniform stained with blood not yet dry, knelt to bandage the leg of a frightened boy. He had just spent hours trying to save wounded Marines, yet here he was tending to a child who days earlier he might have been told was the enemy. There was no manual for this. Training had prepared them to shoot, not to comfort. Rations meant to feed soldiers were now broken apart and handed to families with hollow cheeks. Cigarettes were offered to fathers who had not seen daylight in weeks. The paradox of war revealed itself, men trained for destruction choosing in that moment to act as guardians. But compassion came with its own burden. Some Marines admitted the haunting thought that kindness today might mean facing these children as enemies tomorrow. Others worried that showing mercy would make them vulnerable to ambush. War's cruelty did not stop just because compassion entered the room. It made the choices harder, more human, more agonizing. Psychologically, it was empathy battling against exhaustion. The soldiers were drained, their nerves frayed by months of combat. And yet when they carried a child out of the caves, when they saw a starving mother eat for the first time in days, something shifted. The enemy was no longer faceless. The war was no longer abstract. Every rescued family reminded them that even amid fire and blood, humanity could survive. And in those fragile gestures, an outstretched hand, a shared meal, a quiet word of reassurance, the Marines bore not just rifles, but the burden of compassion in a place designed to erase it. For the civilians who stepped out of the caves, the first sip of clean water, the first bite of American rations, was more than survival. It was betrayal of everything they had been taught. The myths drilled into their minds for years shattered in an instant. The soldiers had not slaughtered them. They had not dragged the women away or stabbed the children. Instead, they offered blankets, medicine, food. Reality clashed violently with the phantom horrors of propaganda. Some could not accept it. Old men muttered that this was all deception, that death would surely come tomorrow. Mothers clung to their children, whispering warnings not to trust too quickly. The psychology of indoctrination does not dissolve overnight. Fear is stubborn, clinging even when evidence proves it false. For others, the shift was overwhelming. Tears fell freely as they realized their families would live. Gratitude warred with guilt. Gratitude for survival. Guilt for doubting the emperor's words. Guilt for even daring to feel relief when comrades and neighbors had chosen suicide rather than surrender. The Americans, too, sensed this tension. Some Marines watched civilians recoil at the very food they were trying to give, as if accepting kindness was more frightening than facing death. Others saw eyes widen with disbelief when a wounded soldier handed his own blanket to a shivering child. Each exchange was a battle against years of carefully constructed lies. In psychological terms, this was cognitive dissonance at its sharpest. Civilians had to reconcile two impossible truths. The Americans were enemies, and yet the Americans had saved them. Such contradictions cut deep, leaving scars more lasting than any wound. Every meal shared, every bandage wrapped, chipped away at the wall propaganda had built. But cracks in belief systems are painful. To admit the truth was to admit that they had lived in fear of phantoms, that friends who leapt from cliffs or detonated grenades had died for illusions. In the end, silence often filled the space between rescuer and rescued, a silence heavy with shame, relief, and the slow crumbling of lies. Propaganda had demanded their deaths. Reality had given them life. The weight of that contrast was almost unbearable. When the civilians finally stepped out of the caves, the sunlight felt almost foreign, burning their eyes after weeks of darkness. Some shielded their faces, others fell to their knees, clutching the earth as if they had been reborn. Yet liberation carried a heavy shadow. For many, survival felt less like victory and more like defeat. The propaganda had promised honor in death, but now they were alive, rescued by the very men they had been told were demons. This created a painful fracture in identity. Were they dishonored for choosing life, or were they witnesses to a truth their leaders had hidden? The joy of survival was tangled with guilt, shame, and confusion. Soldiers noticed it too. Marines who carried children on their backs or shared rations with trembling families often saw gratitude in civilian eyes, but rarely trust. Some civilians bowed deeply, others avoided all contact, afraid to acknowledge that the enemy had become their savior. This contrast, relief and humiliation existing side by side, defined the aftermath. For the Americans, victory at Okinawa was strategic, a step closer to ending the war. But for the civilians, it was psychological survival. They had lived through starvation, fear, and indoctrination, only to find themselves standing in a world turned upside down. The Emperor's divine command had urged sacrifice, yet it was the enemy who had preserved their lives. Psychologists would later call this a rupture of belief systems, a trauma not only of body, but of mind. Families had to redefine who they were, not as martyrs of empire, but as survivors of war. Some found resilience in that role, slowly building trust and reclaiming life. Others carried survivor's guilt, haunted by the memory of neighbors who chose suicide rather than surrender. Liberation and defeat had become inseparable. The civilians walked out alive, but burdened with questions that would follow them for years. And the Marines, standing watch over them, knew they had not simply fought a battle of bullets. They had entered the battlefield of human psychology. where every act of mercy carried as much weight as every act of war. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, the air carried an uncanny stillness. The island was scarred, littered with craters and memories of violence that would never be erased. But within that silence stood two groups bound by something neither side had expected: shared trauma. For the civilians, survival meant facing a truth more complex than death. They had been taught that fear was loyalty, that obedience was honor, and that the enemy was inhuman. Yet compassion had saved them. That realization was both liberating and crushing. It forced them to rebuild their understanding of the world, to accept that fear had been a weapon used against them as much as bombs or bullets. For the soldiers, victory was tempered by humanity. They had carried families from the caves, fed starving children, and tended wounds of people once branded as foes. In those acts, they discovered a rebellion against the dehumanization that war demands. Amid exhaustion and grief, they found proof that empathy could survive the battlefield. Psychologically, Okinawa revealed a paradox, that the most enduring victories are not measured in captured ground, but in the refusal to let hatred define every choice. Fear controls, but compassion frees. Survival itself became an act of defiance, defiance against propaganda, against despair, against the idea that mercy has no place in war. And so, the caves of Okinawa became symbols not only of suffering but of resilience. In the darkest shadows, humanity had flickered, fragile yet unextinguished. Families lived who were never meant to. Soldiers chose compassion when vengeance would have been easier. In the silence after battle, life remained, and that perhaps was the most extraordinary victory of all.